November 24, 1944. Easley Field, Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan pushed the throttles of his B-29 superfortress, the Dauntless Doi, forward. He was leading 110 planes of the 73rd Bomb Wing on a course for Tokyo. The gauges in front of him showed something the Japanese leaders would not accept. The turbo supercharger boost dials rose consistently, keeping sea level power high up where enemy planes struggled for air. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. Today, these huge silver planes would show a technical edge that Japan could not overcome. Hidden inside each engine were two General Electric turbo superchargers. These parts would turn out to be more important than any weapon. The devices used hot exhaust to squeeze intake air, letting the huge Wright R-3350 engines keep 2,200 horsepower at heights near 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters built to be nimble at lower heights had trouble climbing that high. Their engines, without good high-altitude superchargers, lost a lot of power in the thin atmosphere. This was the first B-29 attack on Tokyo from the new bases in the Marianas, just 1,500 miles from Japan's capital. Different from earlier flights from faraway China, these bombers could attack often and get back safely. The pressurized cabins allowed crews to breathe normally, while Japanese pilots struggled with basic oxygen gear that often broke at such heights. As Morgan's bomber rose into the morning light, with over 100 more behind it, the technology gap between American and Japanese planes became impossible to deny. 5 months before, on June 15, 1944, the first big B-29 bombing flight against Japan took off from Chengdu, China. That evening, 75 superfortresses departed, but only 47 made it to the main target in Yawata on Kyushu. The flight showed both the B-29's power and the difficulties to come. 7 planes were lost. 1 was shot down over the target, another was wrecked on the ground after an emergency landing, and 5 were lost in accidents. In total, 57 airmen died, but even this expensive first try showed that Japanese defenses were not good enough against the high-flying bombers. Japanese radar workers on Kyushu saw the planes coming. Air raid alarms cried out across Yawata. Pilots of the Imperial Army's 4th Sentai rushed to their Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu twin-engine fighters. They climbed hard toward the bombers, which were flying between 8,000 and 21,000 feet. Even at these lower heights needed because of fuel limits on the long flight from China, the Japanese planes had a hard time. Their Nakajima He-25 engines, each rated at 1,080 horsepower, did not have effective turbo supercharging. Above 20,000 feet, these engines made maybe only 60% of their listed power. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura got close to one B-29, a plane named Limber Dragon with 12 men on board. His attack worked and the superfortress went down in flames. No one survived. But this single win had a terrible price. Kimura used almost all his bullets and barely made it back to his base as his engine got dangerously hot at that altitude. All around him, other Japanese pilots shot wildly at the silver bombers, but most of their efforts caused no real harm. The B-29's defensive guns, managed by modern fire control systems, shot back with deadly precision. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the Imperial Army's 244th Sentai, one of Japan's best fighter leaders, later wrote about the frustration in his unit's reports. American bombers flew at heights where Japanese fighters could barely stay level, much less get into position to fight. The B-29's speed at that height, about 350 mph, was the same as what Japanese planes could manage in the thin air above 25,000 feet. Just getting to the bomber's altitude used up too much fuel, which meant less ammo could be carried. The engines also ran so hot that a total breakdown was always a threat. The key to America's advantage was a technology Japan had looked into, but never managed to make work. General Electric's Type B Series turbo supercharger for the Wright R-3350 engine was a masterpiece of engineering. Each B-29 engine had 2 of these devices that used hot exhaust to spin a turbine wheel at over 20,000 rotations per minute. These turbines powered compressors which pushed air into the engine's intake at sea level pressure, even at 30,000 feet. The idea was smart. Waste exhaust energy, which usually just escaped, was instead used to do helpful work by squeezing the intake air. This let the engines burn fuel well at heights where normal engines would choke. Each turbocharger added about 150 pounds to an engine, but it gave a performance boost like doubling the engine's size. Without turbochargers, the B-29 would have just been another heavy bomber. Easy to intercept and unable to use height as a defense, Japan tried out turbo supercharging as early as 1941. Nakajima Aircraft Company engineers studied captured technical papers and got sample units through secret channels before America joined the war. Japanese engineers saw the military edge this technology offered. But after 3 years of work, Japan never made turbo-supercharged fighters in any real quantity. The reasons for this show the huge industrial gap between Japan and America. Turbo-superchargers needed metalworking skills Japan didn't have. The turbine wheels had to work in exhaust heat over 1,500 degrees. While spinning so fast they created outward pulling forces equal to thousands of pounds per square inch. Any flaw in the metal would cause a disastrous turbine breakdown. American companies like General Electric had the metal expertise, precision forging tools, and quality check systems to make dependable turbines. Japanese industry, strained by the war, could not meet these standards. Lieutenant Fumio Niwa, an engineering officer who studied captured B-29 parts later in the war, wrote down his findings, which still exist in Japanese records. Looking at a turbocharger taken from a crashed B-29 in China, Niwa was amazed by the precision of American manufacturing. The turbine blades were made to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch and balanced so well that they could spin at top speed without shaking. The special high-temperature metals used to build the turbine were better than anything Japanese industry could make. Even the bearings made to work in extreme heat while staying perfectly aligned showed a manufacturing skill that Japan did not have. What was even more crushing was the organized way America produced turbochargers. General Electric's Schenectady, New York, plant made thousands every month and each one met strict standards. The production lines had automatic testing machines that checked the performance of every unit before it was installed. Bad parts were found and thrown out before they could get into a plane. Japan's attempts to make turbochargers resulted in maybe a few dozen a month, and they were so unreliable that most broke down after just a few hours of use. By August 1944, Japanese intelligence had gathered troubling reports about what American bombers could do. Questioning captured B-29 crewmen, studying wreckage and pilot reports all painted a picture of a technological advantage that stunned military leaders. The B-29 was not just a big bomber. It was a flying weapon system with new features that Japan could not copy. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, an operations officer at Imperial General Headquarters, wrote in his diary that month about what the B-29 raids meant. American bombers flew without fear of being stopped at heights Japanese fighters could not effectively reach. The few pilots who managed to attack said that even when they scored hits, the B-29's strong build took the hits that would have destroyed a Japanese plane. Most worrying was the thought that these raids were only the start. America's production ability meant that thousands of B-29s would eventually attack Japan, and each one would be out of reach of their defenses. The numbers for a successful defense had become hopelessly bad for Japan. A fighter taking off and climbing to 30,000 feet took about 30 minutes and used up a third of its fuel. At that height, the fighter's performance dropped sharply. The guns, though powerful up close, needed pilots to get within a few hundred feet of their targets. This was nearly impossible because of the plane's poor performance and the B-29's defensive gun systems. Even successful attacks often cost the lives of skilled pilots who couldn't be replaced. They died when their damaged or fuel-empty fighters crashed while trying to get back from such extreme heights. Major Makoto Ogawa, who in the end shot down 7 B-29s to become one of Japan's top superfortress hunters, later talked about the huge drawback Japanese pilots had. American bombers flew in a world where Japanese planes could barely work. Americans had pressurized cabins with heated areas, while Japanese pilots faced temperatures of 40 degrees below zero at high altitudes. Their fingers were numb even with electrically heated flight suits that often failed. Oxygen systems frequently broke down, leaving pilots lacking oxygen and confused. Gun barrels froze, ammo belts jammed in the cold, and engines ran so poorly that pilots were in constant fear of them quitting. Japanese aircraft designers frantically looked for answers. The Nakajima Ki-87, made specifically as a high-altitude B-29 interceptor, had a turbo-supercharged Nakajima Hei-219 engine meant to work well above 30,000 feet. On paper, the plane looked great. It could fly above 40,000 feet, had heavy guns of 30mm and 20mm cannons, and was fast enough to catch B-29s. But only one prototype ever flew before the war ended in April 1945, and it showed serious issues. The turbocharger, patched together with poor materials and not enough testing, failed over and over. Even when it worked, its performance was not steady. The project failed not because of a lack of engineering talent, but because there was no industrial ability to make reliable turbochargers. The Tachikawa Ki-94, another proposed high-altitude interceptor, never got past the model stage. The Mitsubishi J-8M, a rocket-powered interceptor based on the German Me-163 Comet, could fly high without turbochargers, but its dangerous rocket fuel and very short flight time made it useless for defending against B-29 raids. Japan's best plane engineers knew what was needed but didn't have the industrial base to make it. American B-29 operations grew without stopping. By November 1944, the 21st Bomber Command started flying missions from the Mariana bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were only 1,500 miles from Tokyo, easily within the B-29's range. Robert K. Morgan's mission on November 24th sent 111 super fortresses to attack the Musashino aircraft engine plant in Tokyo. Bad weather and jet stream winds made the results less than perfect, but the psychological effect on Japan was deep. American bombers were now hitting the homeland almost every day, and Japanese defenses were proving more and more useless. Sergeant Shoichi Suzuki, an anti-aircraft gunner near Tokyo, kept a diary that showed the rising hopelessness among those defending the country. At first, his unit fired at B-29 formations with confidence. Their 75-meter guns could shoot shells up to about 25,000 feet, but the American bombers often flew higher, out of the gun's range, or came in at angles that gave the gunners too little time to track them. Even more frustrating, direct hits hardly ever brought down a B-29. The bomber's structure, built with backup systems and armor in key places, withstood damage that would have torn Japanese planes apart. Suzuki wrote about watching damaged B-29s trailing smoke with dead engines, still flying toward their targets, and often making it back to base safely. Japanese efforts to improve their air defenses were focused on changing fighter performance. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian, powered by a liquid-cooled He-40 engine, could reach altitudes around 32,000 feet, which was higher than most Japanese fighters. But its climb rate was too slow, and its engine was so unreliable that many Ki-61s were stuck on the ground waiting for spare parts. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, brought out in 1944, was Japan's best mass-produced fighter. It had the Nakajima Homare engine, a complex radial engine that performed well at altitude if it was cared for properly. However, the Homare's complicated design meant it needed a lot of upkeep, and quality control issues caused many engines to fail early. The Ki-84's theoretical performance was great. It had a top speed of around 400 mph at 20,000 feet, a service ceiling near 35,000 feet, and heavy guns of 20 mm and 30 mm cannons. In reality, few Ki-84s ever reached these numbers. Low-quality fuel hurt the engines, cheap lubricants failed in cold temperatures, and manufacturing flaws led to frequent breakdowns. American pilots who test flew captured Ki-84s after the war complimented their handling and performance, saying they were as good as or better than American fighters in some ways. But they also pointed out that these captured planes had been chosen because they were in excellent shape, maintained by skilled Japanese mechanics who used hoarded high-quality materials. The average Ki-84 in service performed much worse than it was designed to. Even when Japanese fighters did reach the B-29's flying altitudes, they had to deal with the bomber's advanced defensive guns. Each superfortress carried 10 50 caliber machine guns and remote-controlled turrets. A central fire control system let the gunners work together, focusing fire from multiple turrets on one target. The system had computing sites that automatically figured out lead and deflection, which greatly increased the chance of hitting the target. Japanese pilots soon found out that getting within effective gun range of a B-29 formation meant flying through coordinated waves of fire that few could survive. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was devastating. They had been taught to believe in Japan's air superiority and in the invincibility of the Bushido spirit over material strength. The reality of fighting B-29s broke these false beliefs. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroi, a seasoned fighter pilot with the 302nd Air Group, wrote in a letter found after the war that fighting B-29s was like attacking a castle. The bombers took punishment that would destroy a dozen Japanese planes. and their crews were protected by armor and backup systems. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots flew in unarmored fighters with weak fuel tanks and very little protection. December 1944 saw the first big daylight attack on Tokyo, when 86 B-29s hit the Musashino plant. Japanese defenses were able to shoot down or damage several bombers, but at a terrible price. The 244th Sentai, led by Captain Kobayashi, claimed 6 B-29s were destroyed through desperate ramming attacks, but they lost many irreplaceable pilots in the attempt. Ramming became more and more frequent as Japanese pilots saw that normal attacks often didn't bring down the massive bombers. The tactic was suicidal. Pilots would aim their fighters at a B-29's wing roots or tail, hoping to break the control surfaces, and then try to bail out before the crash. Very few survived. American crews respected the extreme bravery of the Japanese pilots, even as they were shocked by the waste of life. Technical Sergeant John McLaughlin, a gunner on the city of Los Angeles, later told of watching a Japanese fighter intentionally ram the B-29 flying next to his. The fighter hit the bomber's tail, tearing off the whole vertical stabilizer. Both planes fell from the sky in uncontrolled spins. McLaughlin saw no parachutes. He later found out that the B-29 crew, 10 men, died in the crash. The Japanese pilot's name was never known, just one of thousands who died defending their country against a foe they could not beat. By early 1945, Japan's air defenses had fallen apart. Fuel shortages kept many fighters on the ground. A shocking number of experienced pilots had been killed and were replaced by teenagers with very little training, who had no hope against seasoned B-29 crews. American fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs flying from Iwo Jima after it was captured in March 1945, made defending against B-29s even more hopeless. Japanese interceptors climbing slowly to altitude became easy targets for P-51s that could outclimb, outrun, and outfight any Japanese fighter. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945 was the worst disaster in Japan's history. General Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the 21st Bomber Command, ordered a major shift in strategy. Instead of precision bombing from high up, 334 B-29s would attack Tokyo at night from around 7,000 feet, using incendiary bombs made to start fires. The decision was debatable. Flying lower exposed the bombers to more anti-aircraft fire, but LeMay correctly figured that Japan's night defenses were weak, and flying lower got rid of turbocharger stress and engine overheating problems. It also let each B-29 carry a lot more bombs. The results were better than LeMay had hoped. In 3 hours, American bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo's packed neighborhoods. Firestorms started, creating winds that pulled oxygen from shelters and making temperatures of over 1,800 degrees Celsius. It's estimated that 100,000 people died, which is more than either atomic bombing would later kill. 16 square miles of the city were burned to the ground. Only 14 B-29s were lost, a very low number considering how intense the raid was. The Tokyo firebombing showed that even without using their high-altitude ability, B-29s could destroy Japan. But the turbo superchargers had made the B-29 force possible in the first place. Without the ability to fly high, to get above the weather, and to cruise beyond the reach of fighters, the bombing campaign would have been impossible to keep up. Missions from China over huge distances to Kyushu needed high-altitude efficiency. Daylight precision attacks on aircraft factories and oil refineries required the protection that height gave them. Even the low-level firebombing raids were only possible because American air superiority had been won through earlier high-altitude missions that had destroyed Japanese fighter production. Japanese engineers who looked at captured B-29 parts after the war showed a resentful respect for American engineering. The turbochargers stood for everything Japan's industry was missing: precision manufacturing, advanced materials, strict quality checks, and the ability to make thousands of complex parts every month. A single B-29 had 8 turbochargers. By 1945, America was making over 200 B-29s a month, which meant 1,600 turbochargers a month just for new planes, plus thousands more for replacements and repairs. General Electric's factories made these at a rate Japan could not have matched, even if it had dedicated its entire aircraft engine industry just to making turbochargers. The wider meanings were obvious to thoughtful Japanese observers. If America could make turbochargers in such numbers, what else could it make? The answer was clear in the waves of B-29s that appeared over Japan almost daily by the summer of 1945. It was clear in the P-51 escorts that destroyed Japanese fighters with ease, in the naval forces that completely blockaded Japan, and in the atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. First Lieutenant Toshio Ota, a technical intelligence officer who made it through the war, later wrote that studying captured American aviation technology caused hopelessness among Japanese engineers. Every system, every part, showed a manufacturing quality and engineering skill beyond what Japan could do. He was particularly impressed by the turbochargers because their function was simple in concept, yet making them required a precision that Japan's war-damaged industry could no longer manage. He concluded that even if Japan had somehow gotten the designs for turbochargers in 1941, it didn't have the industrial base to produce them in useful numbers. The human cost of this technology gap was shocking. Japan's pilot training programs, which were once tough and created excellent pilots, had collapsed by 1945. Fuel shortages meant that student pilots got maybe 50 hours of flight training, compared to the 200 to 300 hours that American pilots received. These poorly trained pilots flew outdated planes against enemies who had every advantage. In July 1945, during a big battle over the inland sea, Japanese fighters attacked a formation of over 100 B-29s. American records show that maybe 2 bombers were damaged, while Japanese forces lost 23 fighters with very little damage done to the bombers. In the end, the B-29 campaign dropped 147,000 tons of bombs on Japanese targets. It destroyed 40% of the urban industrial areas in 66 cities and killed an estimated 330,000 civilians. Japan's war production, which was already going down, completely collapsed by the summer of 1945. Transportation systems were destroyed, making it impossible to move resources even when they were available. Workers left factories to escape the burning cities. The government lost its grip on economic planning as industry spread out into rural areas, or just stopped working. Major General Arisue Seizo, the head of Japanese military intelligence, admitted after the war that by June 1945, his analysts knew that defeat was unavoidable. American air supremacy was total. The B-29 campaign had destroyed Japan's ability to fight a war. But the government, stuck by military honor codes that forbade surrender, kept fighting until the atomic bombs gave them a reason to capitulate. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, signaled the end of World War II. Those atomic bombs were delivered by B-29s, planes whose ability to reach targets in Japan and return safely basically depended on turbo-supercharger technology. The Enola Gay, flying at 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, operated at a height made possible by 8 General Electric turbochargers that maintained engine power in the thin air. Even at the war's end, with Japanese defenses pretty much non-existent, the ability to fly high provided by turbochargers offered protection against any remaining anti-aircraft fire and let the crews get away from the atomic blast effects. Post-war interviews with Japanese fighter pilots showed a common idea: admiration mixed with frustration. They respected American engineering and understood that no amount of pilot skill could overcome a technological disadvantage. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, who survived the war with 3 B-29 kills, one of the highest numbers achieved, later said that his successes only happened when the situation was perfect. A surprise attack from above with the sun behind him. Against lone bombers that had been separated from their formations, against formations flying at altitude with watchful crews. Even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The development of high-altitude flying ability had been worked on by many countries before World War II. Germany developed turbo-superchargers, but never successfully used them in operations, focusing instead on mechanical superchargers, which were simpler but not as good at extreme heights. Britain mainly relied on complex multi-stage mechanical superchargers that provided good high-altitude performance without the complexity of turbocharging. Only America made turbo-supercharging standard on its heavy bombers, accepting the extra complexity, cost, and maintenance for a never-before-seen ability to fly high. This choice showed America's belief in its industry. Turbo-superchargers needed precision manufacturing, regular upkeep by skilled mechanics, and a constant supply of spare parts. America had the infrastructure to handle these needs. Japan did not. Even if Japanese engineers had created perfect turbochargers in 1941, the nation didn't have the manufacturing base to make them in large numbers, the maintenance organization to keep them running, or the supply system to provide the needed spare parts and replacement units. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey determined that the B-29 campaign was clearly successful in destroying Japan's ability to wage war. While the survey's authors discussed whether Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bombs or a planned invasion, they all agreed that by August 1945, American air supremacy was total and Japanese defenses were shattered. The B-29's technological advantages, especially its high-altitude capability made possible by turbo superchargers, made this result unavoidable once enough bombers were available. Japanese records found after the war showed how much the B-29 raids controlled military planning. From late 1944 on, Imperial General Headquarters put huge resources into air defense, pulling fighter units from other fronts, building thousands of anti-aircraft positions, and training tens of thousands of troops to defend airfields. All these efforts proved useless against bombers that flew beyond their effective defensive reach. The last B-29 mission against Japan flew on August 14, 1945, the day before the surrender was announced. More than 300 superfortresses attacked targets near Tokyo and met no resistance. Japanese fighters stayed on the ground, saving fuel for the expected American invasion that would never happen. B-29 crews flew back to their Mariana bases, not yet aware that the war was essentially over. Their missions were finished, and through the combined destruction of hundreds of raids, Japan could not stop or effectively fight back. In the decades after the war, aviation historians and aeronautical engineers did detailed studies of the B-29's technological advantages. The agreement was obvious. Turbo supercharging provided the core capability that made the strategic bombing of Japan possible from distant bases. Without this technology, B-29s would have been stuck operating at altitudes around 20,000 feet, right in the range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The losses would have been impossible to keep up. The whole strategic idea of bombing Japan from the Mariana bases would have been impractical. The lessons Japanese engineers learned from studying American aviation technology shaped post-war Japanese industrial growth. A focus on precision manufacturing, quality control, and systematic engineering, which were key features of American turbo supercharger production, became hallmarks of Japan's post-war economic boom. Former aviation engineers went into civilian industries, bringing with them a hard-won knowledge of advanced manufacturing methods. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew its final combat mission in 1954 during the Korean War. By that time, jet-powered bombers were taking the place of propeller-driven planes, and turbo supercharging for piston engines was outdated. But the B-29's impact lasted. It showed that technological superiority could beat numerical inferiority, that industrial capacity was just as important as personal courage, and that air power by itself could destroy a nation's ability to fight a war. Today, only 2 B-29s are still able to fly. They are preserved and cared for by dedicated groups, making sure that future generations can see these historic planes. When these bombers fly at air shows, their Wright R-3350 engines making that unique deep-throated roar, few people in the crowd know that hidden in the engine nacelles are turbo superchargers, survivors of a technology that helped end the most destructive war in history. Those parts, spinning at thousands of rotations per minute as the B-29s climbed to altitude, still do the job they were made for 8 decades ago, compressing air to keep engine power in the thin atmosphere. The story of the Japanese forces against the B-29 superfortresses ultimately shows how industrial ability and technological progress decided the outcomes of modern war. It was the turbo superchargers that let B-29s fly at 30,000 feet. It was the industrial system that made thousands of these complex parts. It was the training programs that got crews ready to use them well. It was the supply system that kept them working. These were the real weapons of the strategic bombing campaign. The B-29's technological edge did not make American victories a sure thing from the start of the war. But once American industry got going, once B-29 production hit full speed, and once the Mariana air bases were up and running, defeat for Japan became unavoidable. No amount of pilot skill, No level of sacrifice could overcome the material and technological advantages seen in those silver bombers that droned overhead at heights where Japanese fighters gasped for air. When B-29s cruised at 30,000 feet over Japan, their turbochargers spinning quietly inside the engines, keeping sea-level power in the high-altitude air, they carried more than just bombs. They carried proof that industrial power had become the deciding factor in modern war, and that America had that power in amounts no enemy could match. Japan never foresaw this reality, and once the silver bombers filled the skies over their home islands, flying beyond their defensive reach, there was nothing Japan could do to stop them.